So I declare open this hearing of the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport References Committee for its inquiry into the Australian Winegrape Purchasers Code of Conduct. For the benefit of you all, I'm the Chair, Senator Matthew Canavan. I'm joined in the room today by the Deputy Chair, Senator Sterle, Senator Colbeck and Senators Pocock and Wish-Wilson. I remind all that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. Witnesses have the right to be heard in camera as well. Before we start, I would like to remind everyone that these are official parliamentary proceedings, a Hansard record will be prepared, and the discussions are being broadcast. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it insists on an answer having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, the witness can request to be heard in camera. I remind all members and witnesses, if you are appearing on teleconference, could you mute your microphones when you are not speaking, and thank you very much. And now I welcome via video conference Professor Kym Anderson. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Professor Kym Anderson from the Wine Economics Research Centre at the University of Adelaide.
Thank you very much, and we've got, I think, a submission or certainly a paper I've seen of yours, so thank you very much for that. Do you have an opening statement to sort of set the scene for us before we go to questions?
No, I'm happy to wait for questions.
Right, well, I might just kick off. I saw in your paper, this is just so you have the reference, it's titled Australia's Wine Industry Crisis and Ways Forward. Just a few months ago. I noticed that you did make the point that there is a long-term structural, I think, surplus. So you've just a long-term structural imbalance you've described it as, which I think you are referring to a red wine surplus there. What do you think needs to be done to reduce that surplus? And I suppose in particular for us, is there a government role here to help balance the market?
Well, in other countries, the government has interfered in cases where there is a big surplus, as there is at the moment, not only in Australia, but globally for red wine. Australian governments have chosen not to do that, and I think there are good reasons to not do it. One is that this is a market activity. The ownership of those surpluses are not necessarily grape growers or even winemakers. They could be commercial operations that store wine and sell it, and they've taken a commercial decision to put that wine into storage and find a market. So to interfere would be simply to upset that commercial activity. The only way this surplus is going to otherwise decline, I think, is as the market grows domestically or, more importantly, internationally, and as freight rates drop. So that's been a big issue for holders of stocks over the last 3 or 4 years, has been this high price of freight, so that that makes the Australian product not able to compete in places such as California for selling that surplus.
Okay. And look, just before we keep going, we've just got some media in the room, as long as everyone's happy with that. I've got to just quote you here, though, in your paper. You say the federal government should subsidise at least part of its disposal. I think you're referring to the stocks, the surplus stocks there. Others point out that several other industries were hurt by China's recent coercion, would too demand compensation. So do you think that as a result of the trade restrictions that China placed on our wine, there's a case for the federal government to help deal with at least the surplus associated with that?
No, I think it's we're past that stage now. The Chinese market is again open and seems to be receptive to Australian wine once more. That means that some firms who have gone offshore to find grapes and sell wine to China potentially can come back now. So I think that situation is past and it's time to move on, and hopefully the market will continue to absorb some of that surplus in the weeks and months ahead.
Okay, all right. I mean, there does seem to be, we've heard some evidence that there's an issue that in some of these areas, particularly the drier, warmer climates, there are contracts which maintain a guaranteed level of volume of grapes in an area, and there seems to be some rigidities here in moving away from such contracts to perhaps a lower volume. Have you looked at those issues at all in those growing regions, and what do you think needs to happen then to rebalance if needed?
Yes, I'm not privy to the commercial arrangements there, but CCW in the Riverland has about 500 members, and they do have access to, they do have a contract with Accolade, so that is a rigid arrangement, as you put it, and that certainly is a limitation on adjustment, because those growers that supply to that market are hoping, I suppose, that the prices will return to profitability, if not this year, then next year, and so on. And so they delay their decision to adjust out of the industry, even if that might be in their best long-run interests. Okay.
And I mean, you do state in the paper too that you think that, it says here, Australia should reduce its bearing area of red wine grapes by as much as 30%. You do go on to say the problem is insufficient marketing. So you think we can deal with this issue by greater marketing of the grapes? There's a potential for that, you believe?
Yes, that quote of 30% was
wine,
from
I
others.
should say. Yep. Sorry.
Yes, it wasn't my prediction that we need that much out of the ground.
Right.
But if marketing can be improved in its efficiency, then that is one option for growers in the short term. In the long term, it's investing more in R&D to lower costs and so on. But the short-term issue is dependent on that marketing, and it's not only marketing from Wine Australia, but also from regions and from individual firms, and working together. That effort just has to be increased if we're going to compete with areas like Bordeaux, for example, where they have much bigger budgets per dollar of or per tonne of wine grapes than Australia has at the moment.
Okay. Look, I've got some other questions on the levy that you've had findings on, but I might just rotate the call. Senator Pocock, have you got questions?
Thanks for being here, Professor Anderson. I know you will know as a South Australian that there are farmers and grape growers all across the Riverland who we've heard evidence from, who can't put food on the table. Their health, their mental health certainly is at risk. Their communities are changing. We've got some very big buyers facing a lot of very small players. What do you think is critical to shift in terms of government policy to help those communities, those farmers survive?
Well, I think the government has done quite a bit already, so both the South Australian government and the federal government, and those various measures have been very clearly put on websites. Growers are aware of it. They've been made aware of it through their associations and so on. And that is part of a generic way of helping difficult situations. It applies to other products, not just to wine grapes. And that's the appropriate way to do this. There's no reason why to specialise, to focus especially on one particular product if this is a general problem that applies in various rural regions from time to time. So the issue is horrible, and people are struggling financially and mentally, and thankfully these services are in place, and hopefully if they weren't enough, then governments would step forward and provide a bit more of that. But the situation you describe of a very large number of small producers facing a small number of processors or wineries, large ones, is a situation I don't think that will change. That is the nature of the industry. It's similar in other countries. And small people who get into this game are often there on a part-time basis. They might be professionals in a high-income situation elsewhere and are just doing this as a hobby. So that continues. And even in the Riverland, a lot of these folks who are got less than 10 hectares of wine grapes are dependent on other things, oranges or whatever, as for part of their income, and quite often for off-farm earnings as the rest of their income. So it's a situation that's likely to continue. We're seeing some adjustment as growers are choosing to sell out to their neighbour or sell out their water to neighbours and just lease it and so on. So some of it is going on. It's just that we're not seeing a big reduction yet in the total acreage in the ground, although there may be a significant reduction in the harvested acreage. As people choose not to harvest if they think the current price they're going to get won't cover the cost of harvesting.
Do we have good data on the average income of wine growers in the Riverland?
There are data in the ABS on incomes of various enterprises. I've looked at those data and I don't think they're reliable enough to tell us what's really going on. We certainly have income from wine grapes data in the sense that we know what the crush is and volume is and what the price is that farmers are receiving in particular regions. So those data are available, but as I said, some of these people have a large proportion of their income coming from other sources, not from wine grapes.
So you were commissioned by the Viticulture and Wine Sector Working Group to write an independent review, as I understand it, into the current crisis. And you made the point that it's often in a crisis that unpopular measures need to be considered, and ideas that have been kicked down the road in the past come forward for real consideration. One of the changes we've heard about is moving from the voluntary to a mandatory code. That was made, a recommendation made 20 years ago now. What's your current thinking about the code and whether it should be mandatory or voluntary?
Well, my impressions are formed mainly by the ACCC's two reports of recent times and whatever one can read in the media, but the voluntary code has been improved, I think, over recent years, and everybody seems to think that these have been significant improvements. Not to say that it's a perfect situation, but one has to think of what would be the negatives if it was made mandatory. I don't have a strong view on this. I have been a grower and have had these contracts myself. I know how uncertain they are in terms of being likely to be held up in law and so on. But if they were made mandatory, I guess that would add incentives to big producers of wine, big wineries, to either increase more of their own grapes in their total production, for example, rather than buying if they didn't like the mandatory code. We also have seen evidence during these past 4 years of the bigger firms looking to purchase grapes in other countries to supply their labels into export markets, partly to get around the China tariffs. So the fact that grapes themselves are not traded internationally doesn't mean that grape growers are not subject to international competition, just the same as wineries are. So there is potentially some downward risk if the mandatory code happened to be so strong as to encourage those producers to move away from buying wine grapes from independent growers. I'm not saying that's necessarily a large force, I just don't know how large it would be, but it's something to keep in mind. If it were to go mandatory, then strong consultations would be needed, I think, with all players in the value chain, just to make sure that there isn't something silly introduced into that mandatory code that makes it more less effective than the current voluntary code.
I guess, it makes sense, of course, to watch out for unintended consequences, but I don't hear in what you're saying an argument against a mandatory code. I hear an argument in favour of consultation to make it right. What about your views on concentration in this sector? It is an incredibly concentrated sector on the wine buyer side. Most economists will say that has impacts on the fairness of the operation of a market. What do you think is going on here, and is it a fair? Are those wine purchasers using their power appropriately?
Well, it obviously is more so the case the more concentrated is the winery part of the value chain, and therefore the purchasing power of those firms. I mean, obviously, there are smaller firms. It's not as if there aren't smaller firms who buy grapes. There's plenty of ones in the areas close to Adelaide that may have 300 growers supplying them, and they're not considered large producers of wine. So there is competition out there in that sense, but it's certainly true that the very largest producers of wine and the retailers of wine who are now also getting into producing grapes and producing wine. That degree of imbalance is certainly there. There's no doubt about that. What could be done about it is a separable issue, and I'm just not sure that there's an obvious way of trying to force that into a different situation. The only thing one can do is hope that there's transparency on the part of those buyers of grapes in their dealings with their grape grower suppliers, and that there's the best available price information for them, for example. But price information is very difficult to supply in advance because for the 60% of wine that is exported from Australia, it's dependent on so many things that are uncertain. So the poor old winery who's going to spend another 2 years making that wine, storing it, getting it ready for sale and so on, are going to have to wait until that final sale before they know. And as we've seen, you can get shocks like COVID or China tariffs or whatever that come along in the interim between buying those grapes and turning it into a profitable sale of wine.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Dr. Anderson, Professor Anderson.
Okay. Any other Senator Wilson?
Yeah, just so I suppose then, if export prices are highly correlated to the kind of contract prices that we're seeing, that things like exchange rates would feed into that as well. It wouldn't necessarily just be contracted prices. Is that your understanding?
Absolutely. There's a number of determinants that are going to affect that eventual grower price, and a lot of those things are future uncertainties, like how exchange rates are going to move. But there are other things like consumer sentiment. The election of President Trump has lowered confidence of consumers, for example, around the world. That affects the market. There are lots of other things. The tariff on China is an example of things that can be thrown at people and then suddenly it's taken away and there's a change in circular. There are so many things that are difficult to track or to anticipate into the future that will affect what is a reasonable price to pay for the grapes today, for example.
Kym, have you done any analysis, or are you aware of any analysis on the spot price for bulk wine, which I understand is actively traded, and the contract prices that are provided, in the say 3 months or 6 months prior to the negotiated prices? Like how effective is the spot price as a leading indicator for contract prices?
I haven't analysed that. That's a good empirical question to look at. But that spot market, of course, is only a small fraction of the total bulk market
do you know what
purchasing.
So have you got any estimates on what that is as a matter of interest? Because I do note that in the ACCC submission they talked about there are different contracts where you can actually you can sell into the spot market, or you can take a fixed price contract.
Yes. That's a gamble that other rural producers face. For example, a grain grower can decide whether to sell immediately after harvest or store on farm for a while, or store in the big silo at the port for a while before they sell. It's a commercial decision that's made by those grain growers, and it's the same here, where a grape grower can make a decision to sell on the spot market immediately if their contract allows that, or to go with whatever price is being offered by the contractor. So one would want to leave that flexibility there, I think. Individual circumstances would determine whether somebody wants the cash up front or wait 6 more months to get the final payment from the contracting winery, for example, if they had to wait until September for their final price.
Well, that was going to be my next question. I suppose, is there a spot market? I mean, there isn't in Tasmania where I've been a wine grower, but is there a spot market for grapes per se? Because obviously then a winery's they've got to be collected, they've got to be assessed and then processed into bulk wine, or are we just dealing with a spot price for bulk wine here, where invariably part of that supply chain and the cost of that is going to be covered by a winemaker or a contract winemaker?
Yes, it's going to be a difficult situation. I mean, if it's a spot sale by a grape grower, they've got hours, rather at days at best, to try and sell it. So
that's right.
They are in a very vulnerable situation.
Yeah, fragile
but,
product.
Yes, but is there are you aware if there is a spot market for grapes, but rather than bulk wine?
Well, as far as I know, yes, there's people who are always willing to scrape the bottom of the barrel here and get the lowest price they can and turn it into something. Yeah, I don't know how large that is, I'm sorry.
Okay, interesting. The ACCC submission to us, obviously they made a number of recommendations around the market study that you alluded to, but recommendation 6 is still hasn't been acted on by the wine industry, where grapes purchased from warm climate regions, wine grape buyers would be required to provide information on the prices they've paid for grapes to Wine Australia, and that Wine Australia should aggregate and publish this. So, it's not in disaggregated form, so there's no commercial in confidence conflicts there. It's just an average price. How inefficient is this process if we can't get that kind of basic information?
Yes, I'm not aware of to what extent that has already happened, but that is one way one could try and pull stuff together. I don't know how expensive it would be to collate all that and put it up on a website and change it on a daily basis or whatever. But I'm not sure how that would help the average grower who's going to have to make a decision to sell in a pretty short time frame. But it would be.
It would probably help their, a big group like CCW, no doubt, who are.
Yes.
They're constantly in negotiations and looking at price and volume variations.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of how that's been happening and to what extent it's being effective at the moment. That's
okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. That's all for me, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Whish-Wilson. Any other senators? Look, I just wanted to ask you, I think in your paper you did raise the prospect of raising the levy. Just wanted to maybe explore what you thought the benefit of that and what it would potentially go towards.
Sure. Well, I was a board member for what was the Grape and Wine Research and Development Corporation before it was absorbed into Wine Australia, so I was aware of the difficulty there is in trying to raise or alter a levy structure. We went through that process more than a decade ago now, and only managed to get the winemakers to raise their levy and not the grape growers. So for that particular part of Wine Australia's work, which is the long-term development of the industry, it doesn't help in the short term, of course, but in the long term, building that research budget is important, and growers understandably don't want to try and raise it, don't want to see a levy raised in a difficult environment that they're currently in. On the other hand, those things, a crisis is sometimes the best time to try and do this. Anyway, it's up to the growers to decide to do that, and the other big levy has to do with the marketing budget for Wine Australia. And as I mentioned earlier, I think expanding that is essential to expand our market share, particularly in countries like the US, where it has declined enormously over the past 20 years. So we were lucky. We had free publicity 20 years ago with Robert Parker giving high scores to Australian red wines. When that turned around after the GFC, and we weren't getting that free publicity anymore, that's when we saw this big decline in our efforts there, and we didn't compensate by building up our own expenditure on marketing. So raising the marketing levy would allow that budget to expand. It's tiny compared with what comes out of Europe, for example. I've done some comparisons of that. and the R&D levy itself is very leading to very much an under-investment in R&D because we have these very high returns from current research efforts. So raising that is not going to be an easy exercise either for those levies, but the structure of the levies also could change even if the levy revenue didn't change. It's currently based on a volume in the case of the R&D levy, and changing that to a value-based levy would at least allow the levy revenue to grow if and when prices rise.
Okay. I'm unfamiliar with the wine or the grape industry. To increase the levy, is it the same sort of arrangement? There'd need to be a vote of levy payers and for them to tick off on that? Okay.
That's right.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, look, I'm out of questions and I don't think there's any more, but thank you again, Professor Anderson, for the information you provided this committee. It's very helpful. I don't think you took anything on notice. No. Well, if you have any further information to provide for us, we're asking for that by midday Tuesday, the 11th of February. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. I might just briefly suspend.